I'm just trying to think of like what the, you know what I'm saying? Like is it saying this is what we're trying to do to you in all these shows, just so you know. If you ever feel a slight tickle, that's what's happening. That's what we're going for. In the dead of night, when you feel this, that's Dakota. He's thinking of how to hook you. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Strong Collectors Comics. My name is Jordan, and I'm joined today as ever by my plucky co-host / sidekick, Dakota. And it is a good time to be an animation comics fan. Getting a lot of adaptations that have been cool. We just saw a trailer I did for the CG Watchmen adaptation, which I'm not happy about, Dakota, and I don't think we need it.
Tell me more, Jordan.
Yes, I'll tell you why. Great question, Dakota. Thanks for asking. So this got me thinking. You know, I love Watchmen. All-time classic, all-time favorite, actually, if you want to go back to watch one of our DC ranking videos.
And if the listeners
books.
need to rage, I still haven't read it. So
yes, tell Dakota why he needs to read Watchmen. And I'm going to say you need to convince him to read it before he watches what I'm assuming is going to be an unnecessary cartoon version. And I think what I'll say for that is I think Watchmen works very well as a specific comic book. I think there's things it does as a comic that you can't really do with a movie or a cartoon, personally. And I think that was kind of the problem with the Watchmen movie itself, just sort of shot for shot, basically, with a little bit of changes adapting the comic. And I feel like that's sort of what we're going to get, it looks like, with this CG version. And it's almost like, why? Like, what is the point of it, I guess? But that kind of got me thinking about, are there some storylines or some things that work better as a comic? Or are there some things that we don't necessarily need to see every single version brought to the screen or brought to an animated adaptation?
Yeah, because I remember before we got on here, you were telling me that there was a possibility that even Invincible, that's an animated show right now, was possibly going to get looked at as a live action. And for me, I don't really see, and you know, Invincible is my favorite comic series of all time. I don't think they could pull it off as a live action. That just seems more to me like you're just milking this cash cow until it's completely dry. And I think in doing that, you're probably going to end up hurting the overall brand of the character.
Yeah, well, as a fan of the story and the show, like, what about them doing a live action movie would put you off to that? Because I agree. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I feel like, for one, it's similar to Superman, where I don't think I've ever seen a live action Superman translated as good as what it looks like on the pages of a comic. And I think that, especially like with the art style of the comic, it translates really well to the animated series. But I don't think that the suits and kind of the world itself, I think it's just going to be so hard to pull off in live action that you're going to have to use so much CG anyway. That's kind of like, why do I need a real person's face on Mark Grayson or Omni-Man? Just keep them in the cartoons, and it's a great show. People love it. But it's just, I think people love this show, and then when they go to watch the movie, they're going to be like, this is, you know, and in a movie, you're only going to have 2 hours to tell whatever story. And like, maybe you're going to get to you'd have to get to the point of, you know, spoilers if you haven't seen Invincible, but Omni-Man taking out the Guardians of the Globe.
Right. Then
it's just going to be, I don't know how many movies you're going to try to have to make to tell the entire story. And by then the damage is done. Yeah.
And I think when I'm thinking of, like, to your first point, the animation style, like, there's a certain style to the books that I think seems pretty well to the show. But it's like that sets the tone for it, but it also sets up like this is a superhero story, but not in the way you expect. And it like plays with that, where it's like kind of more traditional comic booky designs, but with like really brutal violence, which is a cool juxtaposition. Whereas as far as like if you did that in film, either the temptation would be to streamline things to make it more like MCU-ish, and then you would lose that vibe, which I think, and then at that point, it's like, what would you get? What would it be added by doing a live action version?
But I think, so I'll hit you with a counterpoint there that I think the comics of The Boys, which I haven't actually read any of those, I'll get around to it eventually, but I think if you were choosing between animation or live action, I think live action works a lot better for The Boys because it's a lot more like you have a lot more street level type of characters. Nobody really needs that like crazy CG of like space battles, and like there's a lot of space battles in Invincible where The Boys is happening on the street in a building between, you know, mostly humans, or even the superheroes don't have crazy over the top powers. And then you also have a lot more shock value versus, you know, when Omni-Man smashes a head in the cartoon, you're kind of like, whoa, that just happened. But when Homelander does it, there's a lot more shock value. And I think that The Boys goes for more shock value where Invincible doesn't. So that's where I think live action works better.
Well, yeah. And I think with The Boys, what it seems like the comics are pretty significantly different than the show. Like it's different enough that I think it warranted a live action adaptation. And I think that for me is when an adaptation is necessary. Like what are you changing it enough? Because like if there's a really sweet comic and it's already like, I love it, it's great, at best you're just going to do like a cover of it, and at worst you're going to mess it up and like lose the essence of it, right? And I think that's kind of the problem with doing a lot of adaptations of specific stories, is it's instantly going to be held to like the original version, I guess. And like if you can find ways to tweak it, or kind of like the MCU where they take like elements of like, we're going to take some of these ideas and sort of retool them and reimagine them. And I think like with a book, it makes sense to adapt a book because the book is just written. There's no visual component already there. Like with a comic, you already have the visual. Like you know what it looks like. You know what the people look like. You've seen the world. So like what's the point in doing a direct, like in Invincible, you're just going to recreate all the same scenes, or, you know, do it the same way. For Watchmen, for me, it's like, you're not really going to add anything to that. You're just probably going to be, it'd be like if you had a song that's like, this is a great song, but like this band is going to do a cover of this essentially perfect song that I love. It's like, I guess it's their version, but like, unless they tweak it, you're just going to be like, it's not quite what the real thing is, in my opinion.
Sure.
But I also think there is that conversation around, would making a live action Invincible, it's like, this is the like serious version, you know, like everyone's going to go see it now that it's live action because it's more serious. Like there's almost that stigma against, oh, it's an animated cartoon show, like it can't be that good or that compelling. And I think when I tell people to watch Invincible, that's the reaction. It's like, oh, it's a superhero cartoon. Which I get, but it's also, it would be cool if you could have, I think Spider-Verse did a good job of that, like legitimizing animation for superheroes as something that's like, oh, this is actually a cool art form. And I think it totally is, but I think people kind of have a hard time accepting like this animation. It's not a kid's show. It can be something that is superheroes and cartoon, and yet also has a really compelling plot and characters, and doesn't need to be live actionized to be like serious, or not serious, but like legitimate in some ways.
I think that's a good question for the Spawn movie, because Todd's been talking about doing that since we've interviewed him, and he's very much like concerned about tarnishing his brand, where he's like, I'm going to make the toys because I'll do it better. I'm not going to pawn it off on somebody else because they're going to ruin my brand. I haven't heard great things about the live action Spawn movie that has happened already, like the older one, but you know, that's older. Technology's better now. So they could do a better job of it live action, but could they do a good enough job that I still worry that, you know, the technology is not quite there and the character of the universe isn't meant for real life live action. Where if they would do more of a fully animated Spawn R-rated movie, do you think that could perform?
It could. I mean, at that point though, I'd almost rather see like an Invincible style show of like, we're just going to commit to like adapting not all of it, but like some arcs, and we're gonna maybe streamline some stuff. Because some of the
I've heard great things about the animated Spawn show,
right?
But maybe that's
HBO did. Yeah, that wasn't too long, right? Was it a couple,
I think it was
season
like
or two, maybe.
And maybe that's a little unfair because, like you said, with animation, like you're probably going to have fans watching animation because they know the character and they're like, I just want to watch a Spawn show, versus you're not going to have the average person be like, oh, let me see what show I want to watch today. I'm not going to pick animation.
Right.
So maybe that's why it got better reviews, because it was only fans watching it versus the movie where anybody could go watch a movie. And then people are like, I don't get this Spawn guy.
Right. Yeah. And I think in some ways that's cool because there's typically less pressure on animation than on a live action thing, I think. So I could see something like Spawn doing well animated. I don't know if it needs, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to see where that goes. But then there's also that question of like, yeah, how would that tie into, I'm sure he'd want to do like a universe and spinoffs, so it's like, how would that tie in?
Yeah. I think that's so much easier to do in animation though.
Right.
Because especially when you start bringing, like, I don't know, Gunslinger Spawn could be a cool live action, because you're just making a Western movie and one guy has a costume on. That's, not too crazy. But when you start getting into like medieval Spawn and like when the entire universe comes together with Redeemer and Poison, or that his name? Poison?
Yeah.
Haunt.
Like
Haunt is his name.
Haunt.
But yeah, all those characters coming together, then it kind of gets a little bit too much. Yeah. And I feel like they'd try to make the CGI look realistic and it just wouldn't. I just imagine it being way too obvious. And yeah.
Yeah. And I think in those instances, if it's something that you'd have to cut a lot of corners to make it live action, I think animation is a way to go there, like, because if you're going to have I think, again, Invincible, great example of that. I think Spider-Verse would not have worked the same way if it weren't animated. Like, I think that lent itself to the style. I'm very curious because Creature Commandos, which I think is coming in, is it December? Maybe a little before. But that's going to be like the first entry in the DCU world, but animated series. But it's supposed to be like those will weave characters in and out of animation and live action. But I'm curious to see about that, because that's kind of interesting to me, that you could have like a live action character then appears in animation and goes back and forth. So it's like, again, though, I think that just being its own thing is cooler than we're just, because I know the DC like animated movies a lot of people like, and there's a lot of cool ones there. I always like more of like a Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which was like a big budget for a cartoon theatrical release, but it was telling an original story within the cartoon version of Batman.
True.
Like, I don't always love like the 1-for-1. Like when they did the Killing Joke as a cartoon, they had to like stretch it out and make it feature length, and it just wasn't. It's like I might as well just read the comic for me if it's something like that. But I think DC, when they're doing like the Justice League shows or Young Justice, things like that, and just kind of making up stuff inspired by comics, I like that more than necessarily like the one-to-one adaptation of a specific story. So I think that's where you get some of the limits of comic animation for me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I don't know, like I said, I think there's definitely times where animation is better. And I think we've said this before, where I think DC is better suited for animation just because of the costume designs and everything. But I guess, I don't know, the MCU isn't exactly like Captain America, doesn't look exactly like Captain America in the comics, but it just seems like they do a much more natural job of it versus like, I wasn't a big, like the Snyderverse, maybe it's just too like plated, but like Flash being all like armor plated, it seemed weird to me. So that's where I like, I've never really been a huge fan of the live action DC stuff recently. Batman stuff, that works. And I think his costume translates better to real life, and his stories are a little bit more down to earth in the streets of Gotham versus, Superman. I don't know that there's a great Superman movie that I love, but
there might be one next year, Dakota, if you're lucky.
That's true.
You never know. Yeah. I
love the idea though of taking the side characters and using them as, like how they did with Gotham, where it was, Bruce Wayne is in it, but he's a kid, and they focus more on like the cop detective type aspects of the show through Jim Gordon. You still get to meet like the Riddler and different characters from the universe.
Yeah.
But it's also not necessarily trying to be like, oh, this is the origins of Batman, because you've got all those characters that are still within it. It's just like a different telling, like almost like an Elseworlds type of show that I thought did a good job. which is where, like, you know, if they did a live action Sam and Twitch for Spawn, and I think we've kind of talked about that, where it's like, you know, they talk about like this other, you know, like talk about Spawn, he's out there, we don't really, maybe we see him at the end of the season or something, but it's focused on Sam and Twitch, they're chasing down Billy Kincaid or something like that.
Yeah,
I think that would be cool.
Like using those to kind of tie them together or do different versions. Yeah, and I think if you're telling like distinct versions, like there's that Batman Cape Crusader show coming up, animated, but it's set in like the 1940s, so it's leaning into like the old school Batman stories as an aesthetic, which I think is cool. I don't think we'd see that in live action, but I think that's like a cool interpretation of the character that I think will work well. So I'm excited to see that version of Batman. As I said, not excited about the CG Watchmen movie, though. So if anyone else is, I would like to know what excites you about that, what is interesting. We've kind of talked about several topics within animation, but if you have any thoughts on any of the above, please let us know, because we always like hearing from you and what everybody else is thinking. So please be liking, sharing, subscribing, and until next time, as always, stay strong. The big one I would think is for the DCU. The first DCU project is technically Creature Commandos, which is like a animated series. And that's like tied into the movies, which then kind of to me makes it a little murky. Murky. This is getting murky, folks. I know. It's like, what the fuck am I talking about? Cartoons. This is just unacceptable. Okay. All right. Hello. Welcome back to Strong Collector Comics. Suitable for children? Hell yeah.